Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime Series with me, Kevin Britz, leading the charge with insights, information, and ultimately effective results. Joining me in today's marketing and leadership segment, communications expert and co-host Craig Page Lee. How you doing, Craig?
Great. Yeah, thank you. Good to be chatting again today. And I must say, this is our last episode for May 2025. We've had some incredible conversations this month. I really have enjoyed the way the theme has flown. But just on another point, I've been hearing your voice on the radio quite a bit the last 2, 3 weeks, Kevin, which obviously means the campaign you've been working on as the voice is really making the right investment to achieve this awareness. Are you actually able to tell our listeners what role you play in this campaign?
I think, I don't think it's as much of a secret as it used to be, but it's the voice of Steve. The Steve is back, and Steve is back. It's momentum doing his thing. So yeah, it's been actively happening in the last 2 weeks now. So yeah, it's exciting to, a few years ago, it was only like an idea of it. Like it would be so fantastic if the voice of Steam came back into the market at any capacity. And from what it's now seems like, it's completely back. And from what I'm hearing, it's here to stay.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And it definitely is back, Kevin. I'm hearing it across multiple radio stations, and yeah, it's a good campaign.
Yeah, we've also last week we also we played a lot in studio, so it was trying to see how, like, what is, because there's an obvious annoyance from the Steve voice and the Steve character, but there's a fun, very nuanced South African nuances that they're bringing into the conversations, and you'll have to hear them when, because we have some like really typical South African sayings happening and responses and actions, but it relates back to the fun of what the Steve campaign was in the first round we ever did it. So I'm
That's awesome.
just taken on a whole new identity, and we're back at having some fun with it. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Greg, so jumping straight into today's show, what are the key takeaways from last week that you can share with listeners?
And yeah, thanks. So last week we expanded on the theme over the last 2 weeks, which focused on the topic of the CEO personal brand. But this time, yeah, as in last week, we reviewed two concepts that were linked to the initial theme, namely how the CEO personal brand influences business growth and actually who sets strategy. And there are a number of key learnings, but most importantly, we got to understand there are two key approaches to the setting of strategy. And the key takeaway points are these two. The first being that there's a formal setting of strategy, and here the executive team, which is often led by the CEO and the board, sets the business strategy. The second is the informal setting of strategy. And here strategy is shaped by the perception of leadership, marketing position, and brand trust. And this is where the reference to the CEO brand becomes the face of strategy is evidenced. So formal and informal setting of strategy.
Yeah, it's a fantastic conversation, guys. So if you want to go and check it out, it's on your anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and it's really speaks to just unpacking this year. And I've already checked the viewership and the listenership on that already. So people are enjoying that conversation. It's a really fascinating conversation. So moving into today's conversation, Greg, what are we up? What's up up for grabs today?
Yeah, Kevin. So I want to stay with the sort of blended theme of branding, marketing, and leadership that we've covered the past 3 weeks. And I want to share a great article that I came across on fastcompany.com titled "Why Your Leadership Team Needs Creators, Not Just Strategy or Strategists." I thought this would appeal to you. The article was written by Tony Martignetti and was published as recently as the 23rd of May, 2025. Given the article opens with a powerful subtitle that reads as follows: "The future of business won't be managed into being. It will be imagined into being." And our attention is drawn into these two principles of managed and imagined. And so let's take a quick look at the definition and meaning of these two words to set some context. So according to Cambridge Dictionary, manage is defined as to succeed in or doing, dealing with something, especially something difficult. Another definition is to handle or direct with a degree of skill, and direct being quite a good reference to business practice. Then according to Cambridge again, imagine is defined as to form or have a mental picture of an idea or something, or to believe that something is probably true. So two fundamentally different concepts and constructs, but really interwoven in terms of the power of this statement. So for me, it was such an interesting statement that I actually started playing around on ChatGPT, Kevin, to see what other interpretations or iterations could actually be packaged around this particular concept. And yeah, I came at, the Oracle in the Sky presented some really interesting stuff, but I've pulled something that resonated with me out of the various iterations it produced. And the phrase, the future of business won't be managed into being, it'll be imagined into being, means that vision, creativity, and bold thinking are not just operational control incremental improvements. These are the three statements that will actually shape and lead the business of tomorrow. So let me give you those three terms again. Vision, creativity, and bold thinking will actually be the dimensions that will shape and lead the business of tomorrow, Kevin. And there's a nice breakdown yeah, go for it.
No, I was just thinking, when you hear it in that context, and I think what really sells, because vision is there, it's the go-to, it's the creativity that's the go-to, but the bold thinking, I don't think it's not often heard in that context where, it will be imagined into being because of the bold thinking. And that
Yeah.
requires sometimes to be challenged at a degree that you don't anticipate. It's not the go-to, it's not the obvious route. It's bold.
And again, when you now start seeing the three together, the rigidity of those three, we're gonna find some interesting reveal in the conversation today. But there's a lovely breakdown for each of the two statements that ChatGPT spewed out as well. So looking at won't be managed into being suggests that the traditional management methods like planning, organizing, controlling, and optimizing existing processes are theoretically insufficient for building the future, Kevin. These methods are necessary for maintaining and refining, but they don't create the breakthrough change. And I really enjoyed that particular proposition. So now looking at will be imagined into being, this emphasizes what's needed. Instead of what it's pointing out is that imagination, innovation, and visionary leadership is needed versus the optimizing, controlling, and a planning process. And this speaks to the power of dreaming up new possibilities, business models, experiences, and ways of working that actually don't quite exist yet, Kevin. And in essence, the quote really is positioning the belief that future success won't come from just doing things better. It needs to and will come from doing things entirely differently and doing new things. Sustains the present, imagining creates the future. And that really is a term that I'm going to keep very close to me. Managing sustains the present, imagining creates the future. And it's often used to inspire entrepreneurs, strategic or transformational thinking, and especially environments where the world is changing fast and businesses need to reinvent themselves to stay relevant.
Yeah, it's from my perspective, you wouldn't say, I don't think people anticipate that or assume that of me, but I'm really, really creative. So I can spend more than enough time imagining potential scenarios of potential what the future could be, to the point where I also know that I need to stop, and I'm like, okay, stop imagining. Like, what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to implement? So I love the imagining creates the future. It's an absolute alignment with me. Yeah.
So, Kevin, yeah, what really is great is that the article alludes to the fact that analytics headspace and creative headspace are quite different propositions. And there's some really sobering facts to validate that some of the challenges that leaders are faced with in trying to move from this logic to imagination proposition. So let's look at there's sort of 4 or 5 references that come out in the article. So firstly, we know that businesses and you know this for a fact because this really is in the realm that you play, businesses have historically prioritized logic over creativity. And for me, coming from the brand communications world, there's always the construct of around head versus heart. And this really does play into that logic versus creativity proposition. So with all of this, we actually see that leadership and culture are rich in data, but severely deficient in imagination. And it's quite a bold statement for leaders to really come to terms with. There's an interesting study by Gallup that notes that only 30% of employees feel connected to their company's mission or purpose. And surprisingly, this was at a record low in 2024, some years after we exited the pandemic. But the important point is that fully remote workers, Kevin, are really struggling more with this connection aspect because physical distance often translates into that mental disconnect from the employer. And I think this is probably one of the key leverages that so many of the large international organizations are using to try and get employees back into the workforce on a more permanent basis. And I'd love to investigate that as a topic of focus. Again, another report, this time by Deloitte, found that only 26% of workers strongly agree that the employer treats them as a whole individual, recognizing both their unique contribution and skills. And Kevin, both of these reports and studies highlight the critical issue that the emotional infrastructure of leadership is definitely faltering, and efficiency alone is no longer the answer. Resonance is essential, and that connects really strongly with the creative aspect that the info is talking about.
So where's the link to creativity though? Because essentially, even if the word like resonance is essential, it's almost an intangible that you've really got to buy into before your brain gets there.
Yes, and that's a great question because resonance is a bit more undefined in the concept of the strong rigidity of analytics and the likes in leadership. So yeah, according to the article, Kevin, this is exactly where the principle of creativity comes to play, in that we need to see the creative skills not just as peripheral marketers or consultants or storytellers, but actually integral members of executive leadership. And this goes beyond the conversation we had a good while ago in terms of trying to understand the CMO's role in the executive board. There's a lovely example cited in the article which notes the following. Imagine a CEO who leads with storytelling, not just statements. A chief human resource officer who designs employee experiences with the finesse of an artist. A boardroom that embraces visual metaphors and even moments of silent contemplation to navigate complexity. Totally new constructs and concepts for a board to consider. And definitely this would be part of a business that I'd absolutely like to be part of.
Yeah, and Craig, I'm in the fortunate position to currently be working with an organization and their leaders, and part of what we're touching on is mindset, and what does a high performing team look like? And when you hear it from this context, and what the future of work really looks like and how we do work, the embracing visuals, metaphors, moments of silence, contemplation, all of these things are stuff that we're currently working on with in a leadership capacity to understand, well, what does the mindset of this team look like, of this business look like, and how do we tap into what the future of high performance looks like? And it's to a large degree, it's less about doing more and more about understanding what we're doing and having absolute clarity and clear vision of how we feel in that space and how we visualize into that space. It's a completely different approach to what the last 50 years of textbook business is running on.
Yes.
It's a very, very strange thing. And I'm seeing it in real time. Like as you're speaking to it, we've got real evidence.
That's amazing that you're able to bring that reality of reference to this point, Kevin. That's great.
Craig, so a good question, and I'm seeing this here, is tell us what the creative leaders do differently. Because I think even working currently with the guys, just the idea of being creative, essentially, and we touch on this in the book, the future of work is human, is that creativity is not not necessarily being an artist or a create expression kind of person, but creating. right? Being a creative, creating kind of approach to your. So I think unpacking this word is essential because creative leaders do something different.
Kevin, thanks. Absolutely. First and foremost, creative leaders think and act beyond problem solving, because that's the expectation of traditional leaders, problem solving. The creative leaders think and act beyond problem solving. And this is fundamentally true in lots of the years of experience I've had in the creative and communications industry, Kevin. But there's a nice positioning around this concept in the article, which notes that creators reframe challenges, they anticipate tensions, and they design interactions with intentionality. Another one of those fantastic words that you use so well and position so well. They consider the emotional ripple effects of the decisions, and they understand that before individuals actually commit to a plan, here's the word again, they must resonate with its underlying story, and that they recognize that logic informs, but emotion compels. And I think that's one of those critical triggers to get you over the line, in that understanding that logic informs, but actually that emotion compels. And what really stands out for me in the next paragraph is that in uncertain times, strategy provides direction. We know that, but storytelling fosters alignment. A good story will bring people in and take them on the journey. Data offers explanations, design inspires action. So you can see here the head and the heart and the art and the science components really balancing each other here. And leaders in this space treat organizational culture as a canvas, viewing each initiative as an opportunity for meaning making. Again, another really wonderful phrase. They might commence a product launch with a narrative circle instead of a sales chart, or they might actually conclude a quarterly review with a thought-provoking question rather than a performance dashboard. And there you can see straight away that the creative leader component and construct is fundamentally different to the traditional leader who's looking at the dashboards and analytics and data.
Right, and this is why, and maybe I didn't put it into wonderful language like this, but why I wrote the book and why I wanted to write the book is based on that one line that they recognize that logic informs, but emotion compels. That's
Yes,
part of the intention of writing The Future of Work is Human is based on the fact that it is comes from an emotional perspective, comes from a human perspective, right? And that's part of what makes it so brilliant is that it's emotional compelling that leads to creativity. But I love that. Thank you,
absolutely.
Craig. So going back,
I thought you'd appreciate this.
yeah, no, it resonates completely. I think it's brilliant. But going back to our previous conversations on the making up of the C-suite, could creatives lead the boardroom? And I think, I mean, I know what my opinion would be, but like,
My great question. And from the get-go, my opinion would be yes, they can, but absolutely only with the right training in place, Kevin, because they still need to fall back onto the notion of data insights and analytics. And in many instances, creative thinking creatives are not attuned to that, the importance of that proposition. So yeah, but let's look at what the article tells us on this particular point, because right from the get-go, we know that just imagine a leadership meeting that begins not with a status update, Kevin, but actually with a question that says, what story are we living right now? And is it the right one we want to be telling as the organization? Who asks that question at the start of a board meeting? Not the people I know or have worked with in terms of corporates.
it's usually
Yeah.
not even
Exactly. So instead of diving into, the objectives and the key results, Kevin, team members could get to reflect on the narrative that's actually shaping the organization and assess its alignment with the goals. And again, they're setting financial targets and goals. There's always a measure of analytics against it. But are you assessing the alignment and bringing people along with the story and the narrative around the first question that's asked? Not necessarily. Again, yeah, imagine strategy sessions resembling a creative studio more than command centers, where whiteboards adorned with sketches, not just key performance indicators, and where you might like this one, ambient music is actually setting the tone. And more than people actually realize, Silence can also be embraced as a space for contemplation. How many board meetings introduce the concept of silence into the space? Not
No,
many.
not I don't have any.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, in times of crisis, though, Kevin, the initial inquiry isn't how do we manage this, but actually, what does the moment ask of us as humans? And I love the human-centered, purpose-driven proposition in this particular instance as well. And if the approach seems radical, it's only because we've separated creativity from leadership in just about forever. And this separation is fundamentally contributed to the misalignment of teams, ineffective strategies, and stagnant organizations. Bold statements, but that is the reality. And, the reality is to envisage one that's covered in more detail in the framework referenced in the article, which I want to take you through in a while, but really to shift that thinking, to challenge the narrative and just bring all of these new behaviors into the leadership role in board.
Yeah, I think, Craig, it's when you just speak of, and like you say, just the silence, taking some silence. And I think a very significant conversation is, what is the story we're telling? Like, what is the story we're telling? And taking some time to kind of ruminate. But what I think also plays into this, and I mean, it's not something we've mentioned now, but recently someone mentioned there's always going to be power dynamics, right? And depending on what board you're running and depending on who's on the board, you're either going to really push through and work well together with having less power dynamics at play, or you're going to have a power dynamic playing kind of board. So, it's all contextual.
And, yeah, again, a great point you make, Kevin, because if one looks at, we're flipping this in light of how do you bring creatives into the realm, okay? And I'm going creatives can, but really need to have the foundation of understanding the data and insights. The same inverse happens is, how do you bring the rigidity of the CFO, CEO, uh, COO as well into a more fluid, creative kind of reality. And the challenge is on both sides of the equation. It's not a one goes in and implements change and it works effortlessly and smoothly. Not
Craig, a good frame for that would be, someone once taught me this, and is think of it as a symphony. That sometimes the entire orchestra plays, but sometimes the trumpets play, sometimes the strings play. And so there has to be a balance, but in totality, it's a beautiful piece of music, right? So think of the boardroom as an orchestra. At times it's going to sound easier, it's going to be gentle, the approach, the tone of what it's, of the piece of music and that moment is gentler. But then there's moments where the entire orchestra gets involved and it's a big, loud, you know, when we use it in that context, there's ebbs and flows and ease because it doesn't need to be completely creative and it doesn't need to be completely rigid. But essentially there has to be some beautiful, malleable, you know, combination of expert coming together.
I really like your picking up on music and the symphony. And I'll tell you why. Because the one thing that drives all of this is actually the symphony conductor and the baton that they use. And I was very fortunate in my career to have been selected as top 30 future leaders in WPP, and their leadership development program is called the Maestro program. And we were taken to the south of France. This is while I was living in and working with WPP in the UK. And they ran the program in the south of France in Bandol, and we had members of the French, and it was just total surprise to us. We went to an offsite experience and we had to sit in formation, but they kept different seats next to us empty. And then as the sort of the essence of the story that they started telling us was on playing, we got to understand that it was about a music conductor, and they had the leading, from the French National Orchestra conductor starting to tell us the story of managing and how he manages his orchestra. And at each of the sort of the chapters that he paused at, another member of the orchestra came in with a different instrument. And he demonstrated exactly that to us in real life with members of the French National Orchestra in terms of how he was able to bring the unity together, but also how he was able to ensure that only one component contributed to their piece at this point in time. So music is a great reference in terms of how it all can work together, or how there are moments in a song or piece of script that, or at least music, that only one or two instruments are relevant. But when the piece is complete, everybody has participated in this masterpiece, but it's been enabled and held together by the uniqueness of the conductor.
Yeah, and that's what makes a good conductor versus a brilliant conductor so important, right? The conductor has to know what he's doing.
Exactly. And that's a proof point of creativity right there and then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, Craig, you speak about the framework. What are some of the key points of the framework you mentioned?
Yeah, Kevin, absolutely. The framework is really set to explain the strategic competencies that are required to helping leaders navigate the complexities of this mind shift in using design as a way of leading, not just as a way of presenting, because that's always the default. And key emphasis in these practices are not soft skills, Kevin. They're about strategic competencies that help leaders unlock much deeper engagement, unlock more innovation, and deliver more trust. So let's have a look there. There are 4 points noted in the framework, and I've pulled just a few of the bullet points around these for the discussion. So the first point here is sense before you solve. And each of these are precursed with a really great statement, like sense before you solve. And here we learn that initiate major discussions by exploring the emotional landscape. Ask, what are we feeling, to surface insights beyond the data. This practice creates space for intuition, for unspoken dynamics, and early signals that often get overlooked in performance reviews or planning decks. When leaders learn to read the room, Kevin, not just the metrics, they make decisions that resonate more deeply and inevitably stick longer. Point 2 is design the experience, not just the strategy. And I think a lot of skill is required here. Here we learn to recognize that every policy, every product, and every meeting shapes the employee experience. Deliberately craft these moments to align with the emotions and values that you actually want your people to carry forward, remembering that the how matters as much as the what. Design thinking principles, empathy, prototyping, and iteration aren't just for products. They actually belong in leadership as well. At that point of all of them stood out the most for me.
And again, like I'm just listening to this sense before you solve. Again, it's just not something you hear in the leadership environment. It's actually I'm quite blown away that this is actually some of the points that are being mentioned, right? And also, I mean, I think part of many of our conversations before, but just the reiteration of design the experience, not the strategy. As you know,
Yes.
but unless there's an actual experience to that, no one will care. No one will know. Like, why is this? Why does it matter? Right? It's wonderful. I love this.
Fantastic. Third point, use storytelling as a strategic tool. And here we learn that we need to move beyond declarations. We need to bring in and thread through and weave narratives that actually encapsulate and demonstrate the vision, put in place challenges and aspirations, and we need to really instill a deeper connection and a shared identity, all delivered through this great tool of storytelling, Kevin. And yeah, a well-told story doesn't just inform, it invites participation. And it helps teams actually locate themselves inside a larger arc of meaning and progress. And leaders who communicate in narrative terms create this alignment, not just through direction, but actually through that emotional coherence and connection. Point 4 is invite diverse perspectives. And ego has to disappear when you apply and practice this principle. Yeah, we learned that, to incorporate voices from artists, designers, facilitators, and other creative thinkers to challenge the assumptions and expand the lens of leadership. These perspectives introduce new metaphors, key in good storytelling, fresh language, and alternative ways of actually making sense of the complexities in organizations. And when we bring people in to see the world differently, we don't dilute business thinking, we deepen it. Again, a very important sentence that, and coming out of that, we get to understand that actually innovation thrives at the intersection of difference.
Correct. But what's interesting about that invite different diverse perspectives is I always bring it back to some of the work we do around understanding how the brain uses data. And we generalize, distort, and delete information to the degree that, we bring our biases to that based on trying to make sure. But what's beautiful about that is if you're open, as you say, you leave your ego at the door. And if you allow for perspectives, diverse perspectives to be shared, the richness of dots and information and data that you just never anticipated or you have no reference to comes out of a conversation or a perspective or a frame that you've never ever seen. You're actually doing yourself a huge favor by allowing people to differ and allowing people to say it and see it differently. And, and to me, it comes down to the one single sentiment of leadership around curiosity. Just lead with curiosity. Because the moment you lead with curiosity, you can't judge it. And therefore, it kind of goes, okay, that's an interesting perspective. Like, how did you get there? And just to tap into curiosity, the more you do that, the more you learn. Just basically.
I like that. Lead with curiosity.
Yeah.
So, Kevin, to conclude from us, that I want to reference the final paragraph of the article, and it's a really beautiful paragraph that says, because the future of business isn't something to be managed into existence, it needs to be imagined, crafted, and brought to life through creative leadership. This isn't about replacing strategy with art. It's about integrating the two so that organizations can lead not only with precision, but with vision. The companies that thrive in the coming years will be the ones bold enough to create what doesn't yet exist and human enough to make it.
Right. And I think that it needs to be imagined, crafted, and brought into life through creative leadership. And I think it's not necessarily about the art, but it's almost intentionally connecting and associating to what being human is. And because you are, and because you're intentional about that, it
There we go.
will shape leadership and how we do anything in the future of how we lead business based on that. Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, I so know how the word intentional resonates with the work you do and the construct of your thinking. It just really is. It's critical.
And I think there's if we look at the neuro, because working with the neuroscience for business program, one of the core fundamentals that we now know that the brain does, and that's shared and spoken of, very well known already, is the important factor of intuition, like leading from an intuitive position. And you kind of, is that like a neuroscientist is now telling you to think, like feel the way you're making this decision? Like really? Like everything that we've learned in the last 50 years of like business and leadership is logic prevails and do what logic says you must do. But essentially, if you hear it from that context, you start realizing that it's a very specific human thing to be intuitive and how you share your insight from an intuitive perspective. There's no like book that kind of says, okay, here's the way to be intuitive. This is a good way.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a feeling.
And and that's exactly what I was going to say is, you don't just learn that out of a script.
Yeah.
It's comes from the soul.
And I mean, the word resonance, like just for it to be even showcased in this capacity, in a leadership context, people just, it's almost like they're disassociated from, how does it feel? And like, I don't know, like they don't consider that potentially that there's more to you than just that physical being. And, as you say, like positioning it from the soul perspective, like what if you did, what if you were intentional, and what if you led from that position? How would you then make the story unfold? And what would that story look like? That changes how we see the future of work. Craig, but this quote, and I think this is part of, it could be the same piece that you're referencing. The Tony, is it Tony? There we go.
Tony Martignetti.
Future of business won't be managed into being, it will be imagined into being. So I think we'll leave that as the quote for today, because I think it's a fantastic position to off with. Yeah. So guys, please like and share. We will be back next week with more insights, and please go and check it out on all your podcast channels, wherever you listen to your podcast. Myself and Craig have a fantastic week. Craig, I'll chat to you next week.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a good week in between. Ciao.